Elena Voss heard the branch snap behind her before she saw anything, and her whole body went still. The forest around Ashwood territory was never quiet at night, but this silence was different. It pressed against her ears. She had been sent to deliver a sealed message to the border post, a simple task she had done 100 times, yet tonight every shadow between the trees felt like it was watching her. She gripped the folded paper tighter and kept walking, forcing her steps to sound calm even though her heart was hammering. A pack outsider learned early that fear had a smell, and fear invited trouble. She had grown up on the edges of Ashwood, never fully accepted, never fully rejected, always the quiet girl who kept her head down and did her work. That was supposed to keep her safe. Another sound came, closer this time, low and deliberate, like something large moving with purpose through the undergrowth. Elena's instincts screamed at her to run, but running from a predator only told it you were prey. She stopped instead, turned slowly, and lifted her chin the way she had seen the older pack members do when they refused to show weakness. A pair of eyes caught the moonlight between the trees, not gold, not amber, but a deep, unsettling gray. She recognized them instantly, and the fear in her chest twisted into something else entirely, something she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Damon Cole stepped out from the tree line, fully shifted back into his human form, dressed simply, his expression unreadable in the dark. He was the alpha of Ashwood, the strongest wolf in 100 miles, and the last person who should have been prowling the border alone at midnight. "You shouldn't be out here without an escort," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of command that came naturally to him, the kind that made lesser wolves lower their eyes. "I had a message to deliver," Elena answered, keeping her voice steady. "Nolan assigned the route. I didn't think I needed permission to do my job." "You don't," Damon said, "but the eastern border has had scouts crossing over from the Ashford territory all week. I don't like you walking through it alone." Something in the way he said it made her pulse quicken, for reasons that had nothing to do with danger. She reminded herself, the way she always did, that Damon Cole was promised to Seraphine Ashford, daughter of a neighboring pack alpha, and that whatever alliance was being built between their two territories depended entirely on that engagement holding. She was not part of that picture. She had never been meant to be. "I can handle myself," she said, and began walking again, faster this time, hoping he would let her go. He didn't. He fell into step beside her instead, matching her pace with the effortless ease of someone who had spent his whole life moving through forests like this one. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the silence between them felt heavier than any conversation could have. "You've been quiet lately," Damon said eventually, "quieter than usual." "I've had a lot of work." "That's not what I asked." Elena glanced sideways at him, surprised by the directness. Damon Cole did not usually pry into the lives of the pack's lower-ranking members, not even the ones who worked closely with him. But over the past few months, something had shifted. He found reasons to speak with her that had nothing to do with pack business. He remembered small details about her life that she was certain she had never mentioned twice. She had told herself it meant nothing, that an alpha simply paid closer attention to everyone around him, that she was imagining a connection that did not exist. But the way he was looking at her now, in the dim light of the forest, made it much harder to believe that. "I'm fine," she said finally. "Truly, you don't need to worry about me." "I worry about everyone in this pack," he said, though something in his tone suggested that was not quite the truth, not when it came to her. They reached the border post a few minutes later, and Elena handed the message to the waiting guard without incident. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly now that her task was complete, and she turned to head back toward the main grounds, expecting Damon to peel off toward his own duties. Instead, he continued walking beside her. "You don't need to escort me back," she said. "I know the way." "I know you do." He didn't stop walking. "I'd like to anyway." She let out a slow breath, unsure whether to be flattered or unsettled by his persistence. In truth, it was both. 3 years of quietly admiring a man she could never have had taught her to guard her feelings carefully, to keep them locked away where no one, especially not Damon himself, could ever glimpse them. But it was becoming harder every day to remember why that mattered, especially when he kept finding reasons to be close to her. "The engagement ceremony is in 2 weeks," she said, mostly to remind herself as much as him. "You should be preparing for that, not walking border patrols with your assistant." Something flickered across his face at the mention of the ceremony, gone before she could name it. "The engagement is a political matter," he said carefully. "It doesn't change my responsibilities here." "It changes everything," Elena said quietly. "It's supposed to end years of conflict between our territories. That's not a small thing." "I know what it's supposed to do," Damon said, an edge creeping into his voice that she had never heard directed at her before. He caught himself and softened it almost immediately. "I'm sorry. It's been a long few weeks." They walked the rest of the way back in silence, though it was not an uncomfortable one. When they reached the edge of the main grounds, where the pack houses and training fields spread out beneath the moonlight, Damon finally stopped. "Elena." The way he said her name made her chest tighten. "Thank you for trusting me to walk with you." "Of course," she said, though the words felt inadequate for whatever was passing between them. "Good night, Damon." She turned to leave, but his hand caught her wrist gently, just for a moment, just long enough to make her breath catch in her throat. He released her almost as quickly as he had reached for her, as though he had surprised even himself. "Be careful," he said. "Please." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and walked away before either of them could say anything more. Behind her, she could feel his eyes following her the entire way, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that whatever was happening between them was no longer something she could simply will away. The next morning, Elena arrived at the main house early, as she did every day, to organize the Alpha's schedule and handle the pack's correspondence. Ivy Marsh, her closest friend in Ashwood and one of the few people who had never treated her like an outsider, was already waiting, with 2 cups of tea and a look on her face that told Elena she had something to say. "You look like you didn't sleep," Ivy said, handing her a cup. "I didn't, really. Let me guess. It has something to do with a certain Alpha walking you home last night." Ivy's eyebrows rose knowingly. "Don't look at me like that. People talk. Nolan saw you 2 come back together." Elena's stomach dropped. It wasn't anything. He was worried about the border patrols. "Elena," Ivy's voice softened, losing its teasing edge. "I've known you a long time. I've watched you fall for him little by little for 3 years, and I've never said anything because it wasn't my place. But he's getting married in 2 weeks, to Seraphine Ashford. Whatever is happening between you 2 right now, it needs to stop before it destroys you." "Nothing is happening," Elena said, though even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. "Then why do you look like you're about to cry just talking about it?" Elena didn't have an answer for that. She busied herself with the morning's paperwork instead, sorting through requests and reports, trying to focus on anything other than the warmth she could still feel where Damon's fingers had brushed her wrist. It was foolish, she told herself. Whatever spark existed between them could never be allowed to grow. The alliance between Ashwood and the Ashford pack depended on that marriage. Too many lives had already been lost in the years of conflict before the treaty was proposed. She would not be the reason it fell apart. But foolishness, she was quickly learning, rarely listened to reason. Later that day, Damon called her into his study to review preparations for the engagement ceremony, a routine task she had handled dozens of times for other pack events. This time, however, the moment she stepped through the door, she could tell something was different. He was standing by the window instead of seated at his desk, and the papers she expected to find spread out before him were nowhere in sight. "You wanted to see me about the ceremony arrangements?" she asked, keeping her voice professional. "Actually," Damon said, turning to face her, "I wanted to see you." The directness of it caught her off guard. "Damon, we talked about this. There are lines we can't cross. I know. His jaw tightened. I've told myself the same thing every day for months. It hasn't made it any easier. It has to, Elena said, more firmly than she felt. In 2 weeks, you're going to stand in front of both packs and promise yourself to someone else. Nothing that happens between us now can change that. What if I don't want it to happen? His voice was low, almost desperate, a tone she had never heard from the composed, controlled alpha she had known for years. What if every time I look at you, I forget why I agreed to any of this in the first place? Elena's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. Every instinct told her to step back, to remind him of his duty, to protect the fragile peace that so many people depended on. But standing there, close enough to see the raw honesty in his eyes, she found it almost impossible to remember why any of that mattered more than the way he was looking at her right now. "You don't mean that," she whispered, though she desperately wanted him to. "I mean every word," Damon said, taking a step closer. "I've tried to stop thinking about you, Elena. I can't." The air between them felt charged, dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff with the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She knew, with absolute certainty, that if she stayed in that room a moment longer, something would happen that neither of them could take back. And so, gathering every ounce of willpower she possessed, she stepped away. "I have to go," she said, and before he could stop her, she turned and left the study, her hands trembling as she walked down the hallway. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, just as she had the night before. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and the guilt and the desperate need to do the right thing, a small, dangerous part of her wondered what would have happened if she had stayed. That question would follow her for the rest of the day, quietly reshaping everything she thought she understood about duty, about loyalty, and about the alpha who was rapidly becoming impossible to resist. She did not yet know that this quiet, private moment in his study was only the beginning of something that would soon spiral far beyond either of their control, pulling both packs into a storm neither of them could stop. The days leading up to the engagement ceremony moved faster than Elena wanted them to. Every morning she told herself she would keep her distance from Damon, and every day some small excuse pulled them back into each other's orbit. He asked her to review guest lists that any junior aide could have handled. He requested her opinion on seating arrangements that had nothing to do with her role. He found reasons to walk past her office 3 or 4 times a day, always pausing just long enough to say something that meant nothing on the surface, but carried a weight neither of them acknowledged out loud. Ivy noticed everything, of course, and said nothing further, though the worry never quite left her eyes whenever Damon's name came up. Nolan Brooks, Damon's second-in-command and oldest friend, noticed too, though he approached it differently. He cornered Elena one afternoon near the training grounds, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral in the way that experienced pack officers learned to master. "You should be careful," Nolan said without preamble. "People are starting to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Elena said, though she could feel her face heating, despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Maybe not yet." Nolan's gaze was steady, not unkind, but firm. Damon has always kept a wall around himself. Ever since his parents died and he took the alpha position young, I've never seen him let anyone close. Then you started working for him, and slowly, that wall came down. I don't think even he noticed it happening. Elena didn't know how to respond to that. She wanted to deny it, to insist that Nolan was reading too much into ordinary interactions between an alpha and his assistant, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm not telling you this to accuse you of anything," Nolan continued. "I'm telling you because in 10 days, he marries Seraphine Ashford, and if this pack's alliance falls apart because of feelings neither of you have the courage to name, a lot of people are going to pay the price. Not just you, not just him, everyone." "I know that," Elena said quietly, "better than anyone." Nolan studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as though satisfied she understood the stakes, and walked away without another word. Elena stood there long after he had gone, the weight of his warning settling over her like a stone. That evening, the visiting delegation from the Ashford pack arrived to finalize the last details of the ceremony, and among them was Seraphine herself. Elena had met her only twice before, both times briefly, and each encounter had left an uneasy impression. Seraphine was beautiful in an untouchable way, composed and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who noticed everything and revealed nothing. As the delegation settled into the guest quarters, Elena was assigned to help coordinate the final logistics, which meant spending the evening in close proximity to the very woman whose future she was quietly, desperately afraid of disrupting. "You're the Alpha's assistant," Seraphine said, finding Elena alone in the corridor outside the meeting hall. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elena said. "Elena Voss. It's an honor to help prepare for the ceremony." Seraphine's eyes swept over her, calm and assessing, the way a predator might study something before deciding whether it posed a threat. "Damon speaks of you often," she said. "More often than I would expect an Alpha to speak of a member of his staff." Elena's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "He's a thorough leader. He likes his people to feel valued. Is that what this is?" Seraphine's voice remained pleasant, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath it. "Feeling valued? I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Seraphine said, stepping closer. "I have spent my whole life training to lead a pack, Elena Voss. Part of that training is learning to read people, to see what they try to hide. I see the way my future husband looks toward your office door when he thinks no one is paying attention. I see the way his voice changes when your name comes up in conversation." She paused, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "I am not a fool, and I will not be embarrassed in front of two packs, because a member of the Alpha's household cannot manage her own feelings." "Nothing inappropriate has happened," Elena said, her voice barely steady. "I would never do anything to jeopardize this alliance." "I understand what's at stake." "See that you remember it," Seraphine said, her tone cooling further. "This marriage ends years of bloodshed between our territories. I will not allow anything, or anyone, to threaten that. Do we understand each other?" "We do," Elena said. Seraphine held her gaze a moment longer, then walked away, leaving Elena standing alone in the corridor, with her heart pounding and her hands cold. The conversation replayed itself over and over in her mind for the rest of the night, a clear and unmistakable warning that she could not afford to ignore. She resolved, more firmly than ever, to put real distance between herself and Damon. She requested a transfer of her daily duties to Nolan's office for the remainder of the preparation period, citing the need to focus on logistics rather than direct assistance to the Alpha. Nolan approved it without question, understanding exactly why she had asked. For 3 days, the plan worked. She avoided Damon's study entirely, ate her meals with Ivy in the lower hall instead of the main dining room, and threw herself into work that kept her far from his office. But avoiding Damon Cole, she was learning, was far easier in theory than in practice. On the 4th night, a knock came at the door of the small cottage she shared with 2 other pack members near the eastern edge of the grounds. She opened it expecting Ivy, and found Damon instead, standing in the dark with an expression she had never seen on him before, something raw and unguarded that made her breath catch. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I have," she admitted, seeing no point in denying it. "It's for the best. You know that." "Do I?" His voice cracked slightly on the question, and the sound of it undid something in her chest. "Because every hour without seeing you feels like losing a piece of myself, Elena, and I don't understand it. I've tried to reason my way out of this feeling for months. It only gets stronger. Damon, please." She glanced past him, terrified someone might see. "Seraphine spoke to me. She knows something is happening, or she suspects it." "If anyone sees you here, I don't care who sees," he said, and the intensity in his voice frightened her, not because she thought he would ever hurt her, but because she recognized, for the first time, just how far beyond his own control this had become. This was not the composed, measured alpha who governed Ashwood with careful diplomacy. This was something rawer, something that had been building quietly for months, and was now breaking free of every restraint he had placed on it. "You have to care," Elena said, stepping back inside and gesturing for him to lower his voice. "You're marrying Seraphine in 6 days. Whatever this is between us, it can't matter more than that. It can't." "Why not?" Damon stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and the small space suddenly felt impossibly intimate. "Tell me why my duty to a treaty matters more than what I feel for you, and I'll walk away right now." "I'll never come back." Elena opened her mouth to answer, to give him the practical, sensible reasons she had rehearsed 100 times in her head, about peace between pacts, about the lives that depended on this alliance holding, about the disaster that would follow if he broke his promise to Seraphine. But standing there, close enough to see the desperation in his eyes, none of the words would come. "I can't be the reason 2 packs go to war," she finally whispered. "You wouldn't be," Damon said. "I would be, because I am the one standing here unable to walk away from you." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and undeniable. Elena felt something inside her crack, the careful wall she had built over 3 years of quiet longing finally beginning to crumble. She knew, with absolute clarity, that she should ask him to leave, that every second he remained in that room deepened a danger neither of them could afford. But some small, exhausted part of her was tired of fighting a feeling that refused to die no matter how hard she tried to smother it. "You need to go," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Damon, before someone notices you're gone." For a long moment, he didn't move, and she thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, he nodded, though something in his expression told her this was far from over. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "I wish it could be that simple, but it isn't." He left without another word, disappearing into the darkness outside, and Elena sank onto the edge of her bed, her whole body trembling. She understood, in that moment, that whatever had been growing quietly between them for months had crossed into something neither of them could easily contain, something that Seraphine's sharp instincts had already begun to sense, and something that threatened to unravel everything the moment it came fully into the light. 2 days later, at a private strategy meeting meant to finalize security arrangements for the ceremony, Elena watched Damon across the room with a new and unsettling awareness. He was different, sharper, his attention splitting constantly toward the door whenever it opened, as though he expected, or perhaps hoped, that she might walk through it. When she caught his eye by accident, the look he gave her was not the composed gaze of an alpha addressing his staff. It was something possessive, something that made her skin prickle, with a mixture of longing and alarm. Callum Gray, one of Seraphine's personal enforcers who had traveled with the delegation, noticed the exchange as well. He said nothing at the time, but Elena caught him watching her with narrowed, calculating eyes for the rest of the meeting, and a cold unease settled deep in her stomach. Whatever fragile secrecy she and Damon had managed to maintain until now, she suspected, would not survive much longer under that kind of scrutiny. That night, unable to sleep, she walked to the edge of the training field alone, needing air, needing space to think through the impossible situation closing in around her. She had not expected Damon to find her there, but somehow he always seemed to know exactly where she was. "I keep telling myself to stop," he said, approaching quietly from the shadows. "I don't know how." "You have to," Elena said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "For both our sakes. For everyone's sake." "I know," Damon admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like grief. "I know what's right. I know my duty. I have known it my whole life. But Elena, when I am near you, none of it feels as certain as it used to." She wanted to comfort him, to reassure him, to find some way to ease the conflict, clearly tearing him apart. But she was terrified, more than she had ever been in her life, not of Damon himself, but of what his growing inability to let her go might mean for both of them in the days ahead. Ashwood's fragile peace with the Ashford pack rested on a foundation that felt, for the first time, as though it could collapse beneath the smallest misstep, and she feared, with a dread she could not quite name, that the misstep had already been taken. The engagement ceremony arrived faster than anyone in Ashwood seemed ready for. By mid-morning, the grounds had transformed into something Elena barely recognized. Banners bearing the crests of both packs strung between the trees, long tables set with food prepared for 200 guests, and wolves from both territories mingling cautiously in a show of unity that had taken years of careful diplomacy to arrange. Elena had spent the entire week helping coordinate the final details, and by the time the sun rose on the day itself, exhaustion had settled so deeply into her bones that she almost welcomed the distraction of the work ahead. Almost. She kept to the edges of the preparations, managing supply deliveries and guest logistics, doing everything in her power to stay out of Damon's immediate circle. It was easier during the daylight hours, with so many people watching, so many tasks demanding attention. But she felt his eyes find her more than once across the crowded grounds, and each time, the same dangerous warmth spread through her chest that she had spent days trying to convince herself did not exist anymore. By afternoon, the formal ceremony began. Alaric Ashford, Seraphine's father and the alpha of their territory, stood at the head of the gathering alongside Damon, the two men exchanging the careful, measured words of alliance that generations before them had failed to speak. Seraphine stood beside Damon in a pale gown, composed and regal, every inch the future alpha's mate the treaty required her to be. Elena watched from the back of the crowd, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon air, and told herself that this was exactly how things were supposed to be. This was the peace so many people had fought and died for. This was bigger than any feeling she carried for a man who could never be hers. The ceremony proceeded through its formal stages, promises exchanged, alliances sealed with ritual words older than either pack's current leadership. When it came time for Damon to speak his vow of commitment to Seraphine, Elena watched his face carefully, searching for some flicker of the conflict she knew was tearing through him. His expression remained composed, controlled, every bit the alpha his people needed him to be in that moment. Only his eyes betrayed him, drifting once, briefly, toward the back of the crowd where she stood, before he caught himself and returned his full attention to Seraphine. No one else seemed to notice. No one except Callum Gray, who stood near the front of the gathering beside Seraphine's family, his sharp gaze following the same brief path Damon's eyes had taken, landing squarely on Elena before returning to the ceremony as though nothing had happened at all. Elena's stomach twisted with dread. She told herself it meant nothing, that Callum was simply an alert enforcer doing his job, scanning the crowd out of habit. But the cold, deliberate way he had looked at her afterward left her with the unmistakable feeling that she had just been marked as something worth watching. The formal ceremony gave way to a celebration that stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the grounds as both packs mingled with a cautious optimism that Elena wished she could share fully. She busied herself helping manage the event from a distance, refilling supplies, coordinating with the kitchen staff, doing anything that kept her hands occupied and her mind, however briefly, away from the two people at the center of the celebration. It was well past dark when Nolan found her near the supply tents, his expression tense in a way that immediately put her on alert. "Damon wants to see you," he said quietly. "Now, before he does something reckless." "Nolan, I can't." "I know," Nolan said, cutting her off, his voice low and urgent. "Believe me, I know exactly what tonight means, and exactly how dangerous this is. But he's been drinking, Elena, more than I've ever seen him drink, and he keeps asking about you. If I don't get you to talk him down quietly, he's going to do something far more obvious in front of 200 guests, and that will be so much worse." Elena's heart pounded as she followed Nolan away from the main celebration, toward a quiet side building normally used for pack meetings. The noise of the party faded behind them as they walked, replaced by an uneasy silence that made every step feel heavier than the last. She found Damon alone in the small meeting room, standing near the window with a glass in his hand that he set down the moment she entered. Nolan closed the door behind her and remained outside, a silent guard against anyone who might interrupt. "You shouldn't have sent for me," Elena said immediately. "Tonight of all nights, Damon, this is exactly what we can't do." "I signed the vow," he said, his voice rough, quieter than she had ever heard it. "I stood in front of everyone and promised myself to a woman I don't love, to save a peace I do believe in, and the entire time, all I could think about was you standing at the back of the crowd, wishing I could walk away from all of it." "Don't say that." Elena's voice trembled. "Please, don't say that tonight." "Why not?" he said, crossing the small distance between them before she could stop him. "Tell me you don't feel the same way, and I swear to you, I will never bring this up again. I will marry Seraphine, I will honor the alliance, and I will bury whatever this is for the rest of my life, if you can look me in the eye right now and tell me you don't feel anything for me." Elena stared up at him, every rational thought in her mind screaming at her to lie, to protect them both from the disaster unfolding, to say the words that would end this before it went any further. But when she opened her mouth, the lie refused to come. "That's not fair," she whispered instead. "You know it's not fair to ask me that." "I know," Damon said, his composure finally breaking entirely. "I know it isn't fair. None of this is fair. But I am done pretending I don't feel this, Elena. I have tried for months, and I cannot do it anymore." Before she could respond, before either of them could stop what was happening, the door opened. Callum Gray stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his gaze moving slowly between the two of them, with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Nolan appeared behind Callum a heartbeat later, his expression tight with alarm, clearly having failed to intercept him in time. "Alpha Cole," Callum said, his voice carefully neutral, though something dangerous simmered beneath it. "Lady Seraphine is asking for you. She's been asking for some time." The silence that followed felt endless. Damon stepped back from Elena immediately, though the damage, they both understood instantly, had already been done. Callum's eyes lingered on Elena for one final, assessing moment before he turned and walked back toward the celebration, leaving the door open behind him in a silence far louder than any accusation could have been. "He saw," Elena said, her voice barely audible. "Damon, he saw everything." "I'll handle it," Damon said, though the certainty in his voice sounded forced even to her ears. "How?" Elena's panic rose sharply. "How exactly do you plan to handle an enforcer from Seraphine's own family walking in on a moment like that? This isn't something you can smooth over with authority, Damon." "This is exactly what she warned me about." Nolan stepped fully into the room now, closing the door behind him, his expression grim. "We need to think carefully about how this is managed," he said. "If Callum reports what he saw honestly, and there's no reason to think he won't, this could unravel everything within hours." "Then I'll speak to Seraphine myself," Damon said. "I'll explain." "Explain what?" Elena's voice cracked with fear and frustration. "That her fiancé was alone with another woman on their engagement night, saying the things you just said to me? Damon, there's nothing you can say that makes this better. There's only damage control now, and even that might not be enough." The three of them stood in tense silence, the celebration continuing obliviously beyond the walls, laughter and music drifting faintly through the night as though nothing at all had changed. But everything had changed. Elena could feel it settling over her like a shadow, the certainty that whatever fragile secret she and Damon had managed to protect for months had just slipped entirely beyond their control. "I need to leave," Elena finally said, "before anyone else sees us together tonight. I need to go back to my quarters and stay far away from all of this until we know what Callum intends to do." Damon reached for her hand, and for once, she didn't pull away immediately. allowing herself one final, fleeting moment of contact before pulling back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for all of it, for putting you in this position tonight." "It's not your apology to give," Elena said, though there was no real anger in her voice, only exhaustion and dread. "Not anymore. Whatever happens next, we brought this on ourselves." She left the meeting room without waiting for a response, moving quickly through the dark grounds back toward her cottage, avoiding the celebration entirely. Behind her, she could hear Nolan's low, urgent voice speaking to Damon, though she could not make out the words. She did not need to. She understood, with a cold certainty settling deep in her chest, that whatever peace had existed in her life until tonight had just come to an end, and that the consequences of the moment Callum Gray had witnessed were only beginning to unfold. She reached her cottage and closed the door behind her, sinking against it as her legs finally gave out beneath the weight of everything that had happened. Somewhere across the grounds, the celebration continued, two packs still unaware that the fragile peace holding them together had just cracked in a small, quiet room, witnessed by exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. Elena closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, knowing, with a dread that settled deep into her bones, that morning would bring a reckoning neither she nor Damon was prepared to face. Morning came with a knock that Elena had been dreading since the moment Callum Gray walked through that door the night before. She opened it to find Ivy standing there, her face pale, a folded note clutched in her hand. "You need to come to the main hall," Ivy said. "Right now. Seraphine has called a meeting. Everyone is being summoned." Elena's stomach dropped. "Everyone?" "Everyone who was present at the ceremony last night." Ivy hesitated, and Elena could see her friend struggling to find the right words. "Elena, people are already talking. Something happened after the ceremony, and by the sound of it, half the grounds already knows some version of it." Elena dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she fastened the last button on her coat. Whatever was about to happen, she understood there was no way to avoid it now. Running would only confirm every suspicion. She had to face it directly, no matter how much it terrified her. The main hall was already crowded by the time she arrived. Pack members from both Ashwood and Ashford filling the space with a tense, uneasy energy that made the air feel thick. Damon stood near the front beside Seraphine, whose composed expression from the previous day had been replaced by something colder, sharper, barely restrained. Alaric Ashford stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but clearly displeased. Callum Gray stood near them, his gaze finding Elena the moment she entered, watching her cross the room with the same calculating attention he had shown the night before. Nolan caught her eye briefly from across the hall, a silent warning in his expression that told her nothing about what was coming would be easy. Seraphine waited until the room had fully settled before speaking, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Last night, on the eve of an alliance meant to end years of conflict between our territories, my future husband was discovered alone with a member of his household staff, engaged in a conversation that no engaged alpha should be having with anyone but his intended mate." Her eyes swept the room before landing directly on Elena. "I believe everyone here deserves an honest account of what happened, rather than the rumors that have already begun spreading." Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the weight of it pressing down like a physical force. Beside Seraphine, Damon's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides, though he said nothing, clearly torn between defending Elena and making the situation worse by speaking at all. "With respect," Nolan said, stepping forward before anyone else could. "Whatever was witnessed last night has been badly exaggerated by rumor. Elena Voss is a valued member of this pack's staff, and Alpha Cole was addressing pack business with her as he does regularly. There is nothing scandalous in that." "Is that so?" Alaric Ashford's voice cut through the hall, low and dangerous. "Because my daughter's own enforcer witnessed something considerably more personal than pack business, and I have known Callum Gray long enough to trust his account without question." The room fell into a heavy silence. Elena felt the walls closing in around her, every possible response feeling equally impossible. Denying it outright would be a lie that half the room already suspected. Admitting the truth would confirm every fear Seraphine had voiced to her privately days before, and would almost certainly shatter whatever remained of the fragile alliance between the two packs. "I never intended for anything to threaten this alliance," Elena finally said, her voice shaking but audible across the silent hall. "Whatever was seen last night was a moment of poor judgment on my part, nothing more. I take full responsibility for it." "Elena, don't," Damon said sharply, stepping forward despite himself. "This isn't hers to carry alone." "Damon," Seraphine's voice was ice. "You are not helping your position by defending her." "I'm not defending a position," Damon said, his composure finally cracking in front of the entire assembled hall. "I'm telling the truth. Whatever happened last night is my responsibility, not Elena's. I sought her out. I said things I should not have said. If there is blame to assign, it belongs to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Elena watched, horrified, as the careful diplomatic control both packs had maintained for years began visibly fraying in real time. Alaric Ashford's expression darkened further, and Seraphine's hands curled into fists at her sides, her composure finally slipping to reveal the hurt and fury beneath it. "You stood in front of everyone yesterday and vowed yourself to my daughter," Alaric said, his voice rising. "And within hours, you were alone with another woman, confessing feelings that should belong to no one but your intended mate. Do you understand what you have just admitted in front of two entire packs, Alpha Cole?" "I understand exactly what I've admitted," Damon said, his voice steady despite the storm building around him. "And I will not compound that mistake by allowing Elena to take the blame for something that was entirely my failure of control." Seraphine turned to Elena then, her eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and fury that Elena felt in her very bones. "I warned you," Seraphine said quietly, though the quiet somehow made it worse than shouting would have. "I told you exactly what was at stake, and you looked me in the eye and promised me nothing inappropriate had happened." "Nothing had at that point," Elena said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, Seraphine, I have tried everything in my power to keep distance between us. I never wanted this to happen." "And yet here we are," Seraphine said, turning away from her with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. Alaric Ashford raised his hand, silencing the murmuring crowd. "This alliance was built to end bloodshed that has cost both our territories more than either of you can imagine," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. "I will not allow it to collapse over a moment of weakness, but there will be consequences." He turned to Damon. "The wedding will proceed as planned. You will honor your vow to my daughter, fully and completely, without exception." "And Elena," Seraphine said, her voice cold and final, "will no longer hold any position within this household, effective immediately." The words landed like a physical blow. Elena felt the room spin slightly, the weight of everything she had built over 3 years, her position, her place within Ashwood, the fragile sense of belonging she had fought so hard to earn as an outsider, collapsing in the span of a single sentence. "That's not necessary," Damon said sharply. "Elena has done nothing that warrants losing her position." "She has done exactly enough," Seraphine said, "and I will not stand beside my future husband every day, watching him work alongside the woman he cannot stop thinking about. This is not a punishment, Damon. It is a boundary, and you will respect it, or I will reconsider this alliance entirely." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Damon's jaw tightened, and Elena could see the impossible weight of the decision pressing down on him. The fate of 2 packs balanced against her, and she understood, with a clarity that broke something inside her, that there was truly no path forward that did not cost her everything. "Don't," she said quietly, before Damon could speak again. "Don't fight this. She's right. I should never have let it get this far." She turned to Seraphine, forcing herself to meet the other woman's eyes, despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I'll leave my position today. I won't cause any further trouble for this alliance." "Elena," Damon said, his voice breaking on her name, but she refused to look at him, terrified that if she did, her resolve would shatter completely in front of everyone watching. "It's already decided," she said, and walked out of the hall before anyone could stop her, the weight of 200 silent stares following her the entire way, and the sound of Damon's voice calling after her, fading behind the closing door. Outside, the morning air felt cold against her face, and Elena finally allowed the tears to fall, walking blindly across the grounds that had been her home for 3 years, grounds she now understood she would soon have to leave entirely. Behind her, inside the hall, she could hear voices rising again, the fragile alliance still hanging by a thread, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a man who could not let her go, even though keeping her had already cost her everything she had. By the time the sun set that evening, word of what had happened in the main hall had spread through every corner of Ashwood territory. Elena packed the few belongings she owned into a single bag inside the small cottage that no longer felt like hers, her hands moving mechanically while her mind struggled to process how quickly her entire life had unraveled. Ivy sat on the edge of the bed, watching her with a worried, helpless expression, unsure how to comfort a friend whose world had collapsed in a single morning. "You don't have to leave the territory entirely," Ivy said quietly. "Losing your position doesn't mean losing your home, doesn't it?" Elena folded a shirt with unnecessary precision, focusing on the small task to keep her hands from shaking. "Ivy, I stood in a room and watched 2 packs nearly collapse into conflict because of something I let happen. Seraphine will never trust me near this territory again, and honestly, I don't blame her. If I stay, I'll be a reminder of everything that almost went wrong. That's not fair to anyone, especially not the people who depend on this alliance holding." "What about Damon?" Ivy asked carefully. Elena's hands stilled over her bag. "Damon made his choice this morning. He's marrying Seraphine in a few days, exactly as planned. Whatever existed between us has to end here, for good this time." She said the words with more conviction than she felt, and Ivy, who knew her well enough to recognize the difference, said nothing further, simply reaching over to squeeze her hand in silent support. A knock at the door interrupted the quiet moment, and Elena's heart lurched painfully when she opened it to find Damon standing there, still dressed in the formal clothes from the morning's meeting, his expression a raw mixture of guilt and desperation that made it difficult to look at him directly. "You shouldn't be here," she said immediately, glancing past him toward the darkening grounds. "If anyone sees you—" "I don't care anymore," Damon said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Ivy quietly excused herself, slipping past him and out the door, leaving the 2 of them alone in the small, cramped space. "You need to care," Elena said, setting her bag down heavily. "This is exactly the kind of thing that got us into this mess in the first place. Elena, I am about to marry a woman I do not love, in order to prevent a war that neither of us wanted," Damon said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "The least I deserve is a few honest minutes with the person who has made me question every choice I have ever made. You don't get to say things like that to me anymore," Elena said, though her voice trembled with the effort of holding firm. "I lost my position today because of exactly this kind of honesty, Damon. I have nowhere to live within this territory now. My entire life here is gone, and it's gone because neither of us could control ourselves when it mattered most." "I know," Damon said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I hate myself for it. I never wanted any of this to cost you anything. Elena, I would take it all back if I could. Every moment, every conversation, if it meant you didn't have to suffer for feelings I couldn't manage to bury." "Would you really?" Elena asked quietly. "Would you take it back?" Damon hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elena found her answer more clearly than any words could have provided. "No," he finally admitted, "I wouldn't, and that terrifies me, because I know exactly how selfish that makes me." Elena felt something crack open inside her chest, a painful mixture of understanding and heartbreak. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that whatever she felt for Damon Cole was a quiet, private thing that would never demand anything of her. Now she understood, standing in the wreckage of her own life, that it had demanded everything and had given her nothing in return except a warning about how dangerous unspoken feelings could become when finally allowed to surface. "Where will you go?" Damon asked after a long silence. "I have a cousin, 2 territories north," Elena said. "I sent word to her this afternoon. She's agreed to let me stay until I figure out what comes next." "That's so far," Damon said, something desperate creeping back into his voice. "Elena, please, let me help you find something closer. Let me." "No," Elena said firmly, cutting him off before he could finish. "Damon, don't you understand? The closer I stay, the more danger this alliance remains in. You have to let me go, completely, for both our sakes. For Seraphine's sake. For the sake of every wolf in both these territories who is counting on this peace-holding." "I don't know how," Damon admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have tried for months to let go of what I feel for you, and every attempt has failed more spectacularly than the last." "Then you'll have to try harder," Elena said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks despite her effort to stay composed. "Because I am leaving tomorrow morning, and I need you to promise me you will not follow, that you will not send for me, that you will let this end here, cleanly, before it destroys anything else." Damon crossed the small room and took her hands in his, and Elena, exhausted beyond any capacity to resist, allowed it, allowing herself this one final moment of contact before everything ended for good. "I can't promise you I'll stop feeling this way," he said quietly. "But I promise you I will honor my vow to Seraphine. I promise you I will not seek you out, no matter how badly I want to. You deserve a life far from the mess I've made of everything, Elena. You deserve so much more than what I've given you." "I just wanted to matter to someone," Elena whispered, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. "That's all I ever wanted." "You matter more than you will ever know," Damon said, his voice thick with emotion. "That has never been the problem. The problem was that you mattered too much. To the wrong person, at exactly the wrong time." They stood there together in silence for a long moment, both of them understanding, with a painful clarity, that this was truly the end of whatever had existed between them. Finally, Damon released her hands and stepped back toward the door. "Take care of yourself, Elena," he said. "Please." "You too," she managed to say, watching him disappear into the darkness outside, the door closing softly behind him. Elena sank onto the edge of her bed once he was gone, the tears she had been holding back finally overwhelming her completely. She cried for the life she was leaving behind, for the years of quiet loyalty that had ended in scandal and loss, for the man she could never have and would now never see again. She cried until exhaustion finally overtook her, curling up on top of her half-packed belongings, unable to summon the energy to finish preparing for a departure she still could not quite believe was truly happening. The following morning arrived gray and quiet, a fitting reflection of the heaviness settling over the entire territory. Ivy helped her load the last of her belongings onto a borrowed wagon, both women moving in a subdued silence that spoke louder than any conversation could have. Word of her departure had spread overnight, and though a handful of pack members offered quiet, sympathetic farewells as she passed, most kept a careful, uneasy distance, unsure how to treat someone at the center of such a public scandal. Nolan found her just before she left, his expression somber but not unkind. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think any of this is entirely your fault. Feelings like that don't always ask permission before they take root." "Thank you, Nolan," Elena said, her voice still raw from the previous night's tears. "Take care of him. He's going to need people around him who understand what he's giving up." "I will," Nolan promised. She climbed onto the wagon and took one final look at the grounds that had been her home for 3 years, the training fields, the main house, the small cottages scattered along the tree line. Somewhere among the buildings, she knew Damon was likely watching, though she did not see him, and perhaps that was better. A clean break, she told herself, was the only kindness left that either of them could offer the other. As the wagon pulled away from Ashwood territory, carrying her toward an uncertain future 2 territories north, Elena allowed herself one final thought before forcing her mind toward whatever came next. Whatever price she had paid for loving a man who could never fully be hers, she hoped, desperately, that it would be enough to preserve the fragile peace both packs had fought so hard to build. She did not yet know that the story was far from finished, that Damon's inability to let her go would soon prove far stronger than either of them had understood, and that the true cost of his fixation had only just begun to reveal itself. The territory of Northbrook looked nothing like Ashwood, and for the first few days, Elena found a strange comfort in that difference. The trees grew thinner here, the packhouses smaller and less grand, and no one looked at her with the weight of scandal behind their eyes. Her cousin Delphine welcomed her with open arms and a spare room, asking few questions beyond what Elena volunteered, sensing instinctively that some wounds needed time before they could bear examination. Still, the ache did not fade as quickly as Elena had hoped. She caught herself staring out the window some mornings, half expecting to see Damon walking toward her the way he so often had in Ashwood, before remembering, with a fresh stab of pain, that those days were behind her now. She busied herself with whatever work Northbrook could offer, mending fences, helping in the pack kitchens, anything that occupied her hands and gave her exhausted mind a few hours of peace. It was during one of these tasks, hauling supplies toward the northern storage sheds, that she first met Marcus Hale. "You're new," he said, appearing beside her without warning, easily lifting one end of a crate she had been struggling with alone. He had an easy, open face, the kind that seemed incapable of holding a grudge, and dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead in a way that made him look younger than she guessed he actually was. "Word travels fast," Elena said, grateful for the help, but wary of the attention. "Small territory," Marcus said with a shrug, setting the crate down beside the others. "Everyone knows everyone within a week. I'm Marcus. Beta here, for what that's worth in a pack this size." "Elena," she offered, deciding there was no harm in basic introductions. "Delphine's cousin," Marcus said, and when Elena's eyebrows rose in surprise, he laughed. "Small territory," he repeated. "I told you." Over the following weeks, Marcus became a steady, comforting presence in her new life, appearing whenever she needed an extra pair of hands, always ready with an easy joke that occasionally, despite everything, pulled a genuine laugh out of her. He never pried about why she had come to Northbrook so suddenly, though she suspected, from the careful way he avoided certain topics, that some version of the story had reached him regardless. He simply treated her with a warmth and respect that asked nothing of her beyond her honest company, and slowly, cautiously, Elena allowed herself to relax around him in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon. "You seem lighter today," Delphine observed one evening, watching Elena help prepare dinner with something almost like her old energy. "Northbrook agreeing with you?" "Maybe," Elena admitted. "It's strange. I thought I'd spend months here just trying to breathe again. Instead, some days actually feel almost normal." "That sounds like more than just the territory," Delphine said with a knowing smile, and Elena felt her face warm slightly, though she said nothing further. She told herself, repeatedly, that whatever comfort she found in Marcus's company was simply friendship, nothing more, and certainly nothing she was ready for given how recently her heart had been broken. But there were moments, quiet ones, when he made her laugh so easily or looked at her with such uncomplicated warmth that she wondered if perhaps her heart was healing faster than she had given it credit for. Meanwhile, 300 miles south, Ashwood territory prepared for a wedding that no longer carried the hopeful anticipation it once had. Damon moved through the final preparations like a man executing a duty rather than celebrating a future, his interactions with Seraphine polite and correct, but hollowed of any real warmth. Seraphine, for her part, seemed to have retreated entirely behind a wall of cold composure, addressing him only when necessary, her earlier hurt calcified into something quieter, but no less painful. Nolan watched his old friend grow increasingly withdrawn with each passing day, his concern deepening as the wedding date approached. "You could still call this off," Nolan said quietly one evening, finding Damon alone in his study, staring at nothing in particular. "It's not too late. There are other ways to secure peace between our territories." "There aren't," Damon said flatly. "Alaric Ashford made that clear enough. This marriage happens, or the treaty collapses entirely, and everything we've worked toward falls apart along with it. I made my choice when I let Elena leave without fighting for her. I have to live with the consequences of that now." "You didn't let her leave," Nolan said. "You made an impossible choice to protect two entire territories. That's not weakness, Damon. That's leadership." "It doesn't feel like leadership," Damon said quietly. "It feels like losing the only thing that ever made any of this bearable." Nolan had no response for that, understanding, better than most, the impossible weight his friend carried. He left Damon alone with his thoughts, though the worry followed him long after he closed the study door behind him. The wedding took place 3 days later beneath a sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the mood of everyone in attendance. Damon spoke his vows with the same composed control he brought to every pack duty, and Seraphine matched him precisely, both of them performing the roles required of them with practiced, hollow perfection. To the assembled guests from both territories, the ceremony appeared a triumph, the long-awaited sealing of peace between Ashwood and Ashford. Only those closest to the couple understood the emptiness beneath the surface. That night, alone in his quarters after the celebration had finally ended, Damon sat by the window for hours, staring out at the dark grounds, his mind 300 miles away, in a territory he had never visited, wondering how Elena was faring, whether she had found any peace at all in her new life, whether she thought of him even a fraction as often as he thought of her. He had promised her he would not seek her out, and he intended to honor that promise, no matter how much it cost him. But promises, he was beginning to understand with painful clarity, grew harder to keep with each passing day, and the fixation that had already cost Elena her home and her position showed no sign of loosening its grip on him, no matter how firmly duty demanded that it should. Back in Northbrook, unaware of the wedding taking place so far away, Elena spent that same evening sitting beside Marcus near the edge of the training fields, watching the last light fade from the sky. Neither of them spoke for a long while, comfortable in a silence that felt entirely different from the tension she had grown so used to in Ashwood. "You're thinking about something far away," Marcus finally said, glancing at her. "Just an old life," Elena admitted. "It feels strange, realizing how quickly a place can stop feeling like home." "For what it's worth," Marcus said gently, "Northbrook seems glad to have you." "I know I am." Elena looked at him, surprised by the quiet sincerity in his voice, and found, for the first time in weeks, that the ache in her chest eased just slightly, replaced by something gentler, something that felt, tentatively, like the possibility of a future she had not thought she would ever want again. She did not yet know that the peace she had begun to find in Northbrook was more fragile than it appeared, or that the wedding taking place that very evening in Ashwood would soon set into motion consequences that would reach even this quiet, distant territory, pulling her back into a danger she had believed, foolishly, she had finally left behind. 3 weeks into his marriage, Damon broke his promise for the first time. It began small, a single letter, unsigned, sent through a courier who knew nothing of its contents or its significance. He told himself it was harmless, a simple inquiry into her well-being, nothing that could be traced back to him or misunderstood by anyone who might intercept it. He did not sign his name. He did not mention Ashwood. He asked only whether she was safe, whether Northbrook had been kind to her, whether she had found any measure of peace since leaving. He told himself as he sealed the letter that this single act of concern would be enough to settle the restless ache that had followed him through every waking hour since her departure. It was not. Elena received the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the handwriting immediately despite the absence of a signature. She sat with it for a long time before finally deciding to respond, a brief, careful note assuring him she was well, that Northbrook had been kind, that he need not worry about her further. She told herself this single reply would close the door permanently, a final, gentle goodbye that would allow them both to move forward. It did not close the door, it opened it wider. Over the following months, the letters continued, growing slightly longer each time, though both of them maintained careful boundaries, discussing nothing more intimate than daily life and distant memories. But the correspondence itself, however carefully worded, became something neither of them could quite bring themselves to end, a quiet thread connecting two lives that duty and distance had tried to sever completely. Seraphine discovered the letters by accident, finding one tucked carelessly into a drawer in Damon's study while searching for an unrelated document. She read it in full, her hands steady despite the fury building inside her, and when Damon returned to his study that evening, he found her waiting, the letter placed deliberately in the center of his desk. "I trusted you," Seraphine said quietly, her voice carrying a coldness far more dangerous than any shout could have been. "I stood beside you at our wedding and told myself that whatever happened before, we could build something honest together. And this entire time, you have been writing to her." "Seraphine, it's not what it looks like," Damon said, though the words felt weak even as he spoke them. "Don't," Seraphine said sharply. "Don't insult me by pretending these are simple, harmless letters. I know exactly what they are, Damon. They are a man who cannot let go, reaching across 300 miles because his own marriage isn't enough to fill whatever hole she left behind." Damon had no honest defense to offer, and the silence that followed confirmed everything Seraphine already suspected. "I will end it," he finally said. "I should never have started it in the first place." "You said that once before," Seraphine said, "and yet here we are again." She studied him for a long moment, something calculating entering her expression. "My father has been growing impatient with the pace of full territorial integration between our packs. He has suggested, more than once, that a stronger show of unity might reassure him that this alliance is as solid as we've claimed. I think it's time we gave him that reassurance." "What do you mean?" Damon asked warily. "I mean," Seraphine said, "that you are going to stop writing letters to a woman 300 miles away, and you are going to focus entirely on the marriage and the alliance you promised to honor. And if I discover even one more letter, Damon, I will not simply be hurt. I will bring this directly to my father, and I promise you, the consequences will extend far beyond anything either of us has experienced so far." The threat landed with the full weight it was intended to carry. Damon understood, with painful clarity, that Seraphine's patience, already worn thin by months of quiet humiliation, had finally reached its absolute limit, and that any further transgression would not simply damage his marriage, but would risk igniting a full political crisis between two territories that had spent years trying to heal from decades of conflict. He wrote one final letter to Elena that night, his hands unsteady as he formed the words, explaining, as gently as he could, that the correspondence had to end, that Seraphine had discovered their letters, that continuing to write risked consequences far beyond either of their control. He did not tell her about the specific threat Seraphine had made, not wanting to frighten her, but he made clear that this truly needed to be the end. Elena read the letter alone in her small room in Northbrook, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, even as a strange, painful relief settled beneath the heartbreak. Some quiet part of her had known, even as she wrote her careful replies, that the correspondence could not continue indefinitely without consequences. She simply had not expected the ending to arrive so abruptly, or to hurt quite this much. Marcus found her sitting alone near the training fields later that evening, her eyes red-rimmed despite her attempts to compose herself before anyone saw. "You don't have to tell me," he said gently, sitting down beside her. "But I'm here if you want to." Elena hesitated, then finally spoke, the words spilling out slowly at first, then faster as she told him everything, about Damon, about Ashwood, about the scandal that had cost her everything, about the letters that had quietly continued despite every promise to let go. Marcus listened without judgment, his expression steady and patient through the entire account. "That's a lot to carry," he said when she finished. "I'm sorry you went through all of that." "I keep telling myself it's finally over," Elena said. "That this last letter really is the end of it. But some part of me doesn't quite believe it will be, and that scares me more than anything." "Then let it be over," Marcus said quietly. "Not because someone forced it to end, but because you choose to let it end. There's a difference, Elena, and I think you deserve the second kind of ending, not the first." She looked at him, struck by the simple wisdom in his words, and felt something shift inside her, a quiet, deliberate decision forming that had nothing to do with Damon's letter or Seraphine's threats. She wanted, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to choose her own path forward, rather than remaining tethered to a connection that had already cost her so much and offered so little in return. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening. For not judging any of it." "You don't have to thank me for that," Marcus said, offering her a small, genuine smile. "I meant what I said before, Elena. I'm glad you're here in Northbrook. Whatever brought you to us, I think this territory is better for having you in it." For the first time since receiving Damon's final letter, Elena felt the beginnings of something that resembled hope, fragile but real, growing quietly in the space where heartbreak had settled for so many months. She did not yet know that 300 miles south, the fragile peace between Ashwood and Ashford was about to face a far greater threat than a handful of secret letters, one that would soon reach even the quiet safety of Northbrook, and pull her back into a danger more immediate and more dangerous than anything she had yet faced. What Damon did not know, and what Seraphine herself would not learn until it was almost too late, was that Callum Gray had never stopped watching Elena Voss, even from 300 miles away. Callum had built his entire career on loyalty to the Ashford family, and in his mind, the scandal at the engagement ceremony had never been fully resolved, merely delayed. He believed, with the rigid certainty of a man who trusted his own judgment above almost anything else, that as long as Elena remained alive and reachable, she represented an ongoing threat to Seraphine's marriage, and, by extension, to the fragile alliance both pacts depended upon. He had watched Damon's mood darken in the months following the wedding, had noticed the careful way certain letters disappeared from the outgoing correspondence before anyone else could see them, and had drawn his own conclusions about exactly where those letters were going. He did not bring his suspicions to Seraphine. He decided, instead, to handle the matter himself, quietly, the way he had handled difficult problems for the Ashford family his entire career. It took him only a few days of careful inquiry to learn that Elena Voss had settled in Northbrook territory under the protection of a cousin, and it took only a few days more to arrange transportation north, accompanied by 2 junior enforcers, loyal enough to follow his orders without asking questions. He told himself he intended only to speak with her, to make clear, in terms she could not misunderstand, that her continued existence within reach of Ashwood represented an unacceptable risk that needed to be permanently resolved, one way or another. Elena had no warning of the danger approaching until the evening Callum Gray arrived at the edge of Northbrook territory, watching from the tree line as she walked back from the training fields with Marcus beside her, the two of them laughing quietly about something that no longer mattered the moment his cold gray eyes settled on her from a distance. "Elena," Marcus's voice sharpened suddenly, his easy demeanor vanishing as his attention snapped toward the tree line. "Someone's watching us." Elena followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold as she recognized the figure stepping out from between the trees. "Callum," she breathed, every instinct in her body screaming at her to run, even as her legs refused to move. "Elena Voss," Callum said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them, calm and controlled in a way that made the threat beneath it all the more unsettling. "I've come a long way to speak with you." "You need to leave," Marcus said, stepping protectively in front of Elena, his posture shifting instinctively into something more guarded. "This is Northbrook territory. You have no authority here." "I have no interest in Northbrook's territory," Callum said, his eyes never leaving Elena. "My business is entirely with her, and it will be brief. Whatever you have to say, Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coursing through her. You can say in front of Marcus. Callum's expression remained unreadable, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes. Very well. I've watched the correspondence between you and Alpha Cole continue for months, despite every assurance that it had ended. I've watched a fragile peace between two territories strain under the weight of an obsession neither of you seems capable of controlling. I've come to make certain, personally, that this ends now, permanently, in a way that cannot be undone by another careless letter. The words carried an unmistakable threat, and Elena felt genuine fear settle into her chest for the first time since arriving in Northbrook. The letters stopped weeks ago, she said. There's nothing left to end. Then you won't mind coming with me, Callum said, so that I can deliver you somewhere far enough away that even the temptation to write another letter becomes impossible. She's not going anywhere with you, Marcus said sharply, and behind him, Elena could see other members of Northbrook's pack beginning to notice the confrontation unfolding, drawn by the tension crackling through the evening air. Callum's two junior enforcers stepped forward from the tree line, flanking him with quiet, practiced discipline, and Elena's heart pounded as she recognized, with sudden clarity, just how outmatched Northbrook's small, peaceful territory was against three trained Ashford enforcers acting entirely outside any official sanction. This is a mistake, Elena said, taking a small step back despite herself. Seraphine doesn't know you're here, does she? Alaric doesn't know. Something in Callum's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, confirming her suspicion. This matter requires resolution regardless of official knowledge, he said. Some problems are better solved quietly before they require official intervention at all. The threat in his words was unmistakable now, and Elena felt genuine terror rising in her chest. Marcus, sensing the same danger, let out a low, warning growl, and within moments, several other Northbrook wolves had gathered behind him, drawn by instinct to protect one of their own against outsiders who had no business threatening anyone within their territory. You're outnumbered, Marcus said to Callum, his voice steady, despite the tension radiating through his posture. Whatever you came here to do, I suggest you reconsider it right now. For a long, tense moment, no one moved, the standoff stretching taut across the darkening field. Then, slowly, deliberately, Callum raised his hands in a gesture of forced calm, though his eyes remained fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. This isn't finished, he said quietly, backing toward the tree line with his two enforcers falling into step behind him. You may have Northbrook's protection tonight, Elena Voss, but territories cannot shield you forever. Sooner or later, this problem will need a permanent resolution, and I intend to see that it gets one. He disappeared into the darkness with his enforcers, leaving Elena trembling, surrounded by a protective circle of Northbrook wolves who had rallied instinctively to her defense. Marcus turned to her immediately, his expression tight with concern. Are you hurt? He asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders as though afraid to touch her without permission. No, Elena managed, though her voice shook badly. Just frightened. Marcus, he's not going to stop. I could see it in his eyes. Whatever he believes he needs to do to protect the Ashford family's interests, he's not going to simply give up because you and a few others stood between us tonight. Delphine arrived moments later, having heard the commotion, and quickly organized additional patrols along Northbrook's borders, her expression grim as she listened to Elena recount exactly what had happened. We need to send word to Ashwood, she said finally. If this man is acting outside official sanction, Alpha Cole needs to know immediately, before this escalates into something none of us can control. That night, unable to sleep, Elena sat awake in her small room, replaying the confrontation over and over, the cold certainty in Callum's voice echoing through her mind. She understood now, with a clarity that terrified her, that the danger surrounding her had never truly ended when she left Ashwood. It had simply gone quiet, waiting, and now it had found her again, 300 miles from the place where it had first begun, threatening not just her own safety, but the fragile peace between two entire territories that depended on this exact kind of conflict never being allowed to happen. She thought of Damon, wondering whether he had any idea what his enforcer's obsession had grown into, wondering whether reaching out to warn him would only make everything worse. And beneath the fear, a new and dangerous resolve began to take shape, the understanding that she could no longer simply wait quietly for danger to find her again. Something had to change, decisively, before Callum Gray's next visit arrived, with far less restraint than the first. The message from Northbrook reached Ashwood 2 days later, carried by a swift rider Delphine trusted completely. Nolan intercepted it first, reading the account of Callum Gray's confrontation with growing alarm before bringing it directly to Damon, who read it standing at his study window, his hands tightening around the paper until his knuckles turned white. He went there alone, Damon said, his voice dangerously quiet, without sanction from Alaric, without telling Seraphine, and threatened her. "We don't know his exact intentions," Nolan said carefully, though even he could not disguise his own concern. "But whatever he meant by a permanent resolution, it doesn't sound like something we can afford to ignore." Damon was already moving toward the door before Nolan finished speaking. "I'm going to Northbrook." "Damon, think about what that means," Nolan said, following quickly behind him. "If you leave Ashwood to chase after Elena, especially now, Seraphine will see it exactly as confirmation of everything she already fears. This could be the very thing that finally breaks the alliance completely. And if I do nothing, and Callum Gray returns to Northbrook to finish what he started, what happens then?" Damon turned to face him, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective urgency that Nolan had rarely seen from him. "I let her walk away once to protect this alliance. I will not let her be hurt, or worse, because I was too afraid of appearances to act." Seraphine found them in the hallway moments later, having heard raised voices from her own quarters, and the sight of Damon dressed for travel, his expression set with fierce determination, told her everything before either man said a word. "You're going to her," Seraphine said, her voice flat. "Callum Gray traveled to Northbrook without authorization and threatened Elena's safety," Damon said. "I am going to address that directly, as any responsible alpha would address a threat originating from a member of Allied leadership acting outside proper sanction." Something in Seraphine's expression shifted, surprise flickering through her carefully guarded composure. "Callum did what?" "You didn't know," Damon said, understanding immediately from her reaction. "He acted entirely on his own." Seraphine's jaw tightened, fury replacing the surprise on her face. "My father will hear about this immediately. Callum has overstepped in ways that could have started an entirely new conflict, acting without any authority from either territory." She paused, studying Damon carefully. "I'm coming with you, Seraphine. This is no longer only about Elena Voss," Seraphine said firmly. "This is about one of my family's own enforcers threatening violence against a wolf under Northbrook's protection, entirely outside sanctioned authority. If this becomes public without proper context, it could unravel everything regardless of your personal feelings toward her. I need to see this resolved correctly, and so does my father's reputation." Despite the tension between them, Damon recognized the practical wisdom in her insistence, and within the hour, the two of them departed for Northbrook together, accompanied by Nolan and a small contingent of trusted Ashwood enforcers, moving with an urgency that left little room for the awkwardness of their circumstances. They arrived at Northbrook's border 2 days later to find the territory on edge. Patrols doubled along every approach since Callum's visit. Delphine met them at the boundary, her expression wary until she recognized Seraphine traveling alongside Damon, understanding immediately that whatever had brought them here carried weight beyond a simple personal visit. Elena's reaction, when she saw the small procession arrive, was a complicated tangle of relief, fear, and something achingly close to hope that she immediately tried to suppress. Marcus stood beside her, his posture protective, watching Damon's approach with careful, assessing eyes. "You came," Elena said, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice as Damon dismounted and crossed the distance between them. "Of course I came," Damon said. "The moment I heard what happened, there was no version of events where I stayed away." "Elena!" Seraphine's voice cut through the moment, and Elena turned to find the other woman studying her with an expression far different from the cold fury she remembered from Ashwood. "I need you to tell me exactly what Callum said to you, in as much detail as you can recall." Elena recounted the confrontation carefully, watching Seraphine's expression harden further with every detail, particularly the moment she described Callum's insistence that the matter required a permanent resolution, regardless of official sanction. When she finished, Seraphine was silent for a long moment, clearly working through the full implications of what she had just heard. "He acted entirely without my father's knowledge or mine," Seraphine finally said. "Which means he either believed he was protecting our family's interests in a way he thought we would approve of, retroactively, or he has decided he no longer requires our approval to act on our behalf. Neither possibility is acceptable." "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now," Seraphine said, "we find him, and we make absolutely certain he understands that threatening violence against anyone, regardless of his personal grievances, will never be tolerated by either territory. This kind of unauthorized action is exactly the sort of instability that could reignite the very conflict our alliance was meant to end." It took less than a day to locate Callum, who had not yet left the region, apparently waiting for an opportunity to approach Elena again without witnesses. Nolan's enforcers found him at a small inn on the outskirts of Northbrook's territory, and the confrontation that followed, while tense, resolved without further danger, once Callum realized both Damon and Seraphine had arrived together, united in their demand for accountability. "I did what I believed necessary to protect this alliance," Callum said, standing rigid before them, though his composure had visibly cracked under the combined weight of both Alpha's displeasure. "The correspondence between Alpha Cole and this woman never fully stopped threatening the stability we all worked to build. That was not your decision to make," Seraphine said, her voice carrying the full authority of her position. "You threatened a wolf under another territory's protection, acting entirely outside sanctioned authority, in a manner that could have started exactly the kind of conflict this alliance exists to prevent. Whatever loyalty motivated you, Callum, your actions have caused far more damage than they prevented." Callum's punishment, decided jointly by Seraphine and her father days later, stripped him of his position as enforcer and exiled him from both territories permanently, a consequence severe enough to make clear, publicly and unmistakably, that no one, regardless of intention, held authority to act with such dangerous disregard for peace between Ashwood and Ashford. With the immediate danger resolved, an uneasy quiet settled over the small gathering in Northbrook. Elena found herself standing alone, with Damon near the edge of the training fields that evening, the same fields where Callum had first appeared to threaten her, now empty and calm beneath the darkening sky. "I'm sorry," Damon said quietly, "for all of it. The letters, the danger you faced because of choices I couldn't fully let go of. None of this should have touched your life the way it has." "You came when it mattered," Elena said. "That has to count for something." "It doesn't undo the rest," Damon said, his voice heavy with regret. "I have spent months telling myself I could hold on to some small piece of you while still honoring my marriage, and all it did was put you in danger and poison whatever peace Seraphine and I might have built together. I understand now, more clearly than I ever have, that I have to let you go completely, Elena, not because I want to, but because continuing to hold on, even in small, careful ways, only ever seems to cost you more than either of us can afford." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they carried something closer to acceptance than heartbreak. "I think I've known that for a while," she said softly. "I think some part of me has been waiting for you to know it too." They stood together in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything that had passed between them, settling finally into something resembling closure. When Damon finally spoke again, his voice was steady, resolved in a way she had not heard from him since long before the scandal that had upended both their lives. "I hope Northbrook gives you everything Ashwood couldn't," he said. "I mean that, Elena, completely." "I think it already has," she said, glancing briefly toward where Marcus stood waiting at a respectful distance, giving them privacy without disappearing entirely from view. Damon followed her gaze, and something in his expression, complicated and bittersweet, settled into a quiet, genuine acceptance. "Good," he said simply. "You deserve that." The following morning, Damon and Seraphine departed for Ashwood together. The immediate crisis resolved, though both of them understood that rebuilding genuine trust between them would require far more time and effort than a single confrontation with a rogue enforcer could provide. Elena watched them go from the edge of Northbrook's border, feeling, for the first time in what felt like years, a quiet and unfamiliar sense of peace settle over her. The dangerous chapter of her life, finally, truly closing behind her. A full year passed before Elena returned, even briefly, to the region surrounding Ashwood, and by then, the territory she had once called home felt like a memory belonging to someone else's life. Northbrook had become her home in every sense that mattered, its quiet fields and modest packhouses holding none of the grandeur Ashwood once offered, but offering instead something she had never fully possessed there, a life built entirely on her own terms, free from the weight of feelings she could never safely act upon. Marcus had become an unshakable presence in that new life, patient and steady in a way that never once made her feel rushed toward anything she wasn't ready for. Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, built on the foundation of genuine friendship rather than the desperate, forbidden intensity that had once defined her feelings for Damon. It was different, she often thought, in the best possible way, quieter and steadier, the kind of love that did not demand she sacrifice everything simply to hold on to it. "You're thinking again," Marcus said one evening, finding her sitting on the porch of the small home they now shared at the edge of Northbrook's grounds, watching the sun set over fields that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Just remembering," Elena said, offering him a small smile as he settled beside her. "It feels strange sometimes, how far away that whole part of my life feels now." "Any regrets?" Marcus asked gently, though there was no anxiety in the question, only genuine curiosity. Elena considered it honestly before answering. "I think I needed to go through all of it to end up here," she said finally. "The pain, the fear, even the parts I wish I could have avoided entirely. It taught me things about myself I don't think I would have learned any other way. I'm not glad it happened the way it did, but I'm grateful for where it eventually led me." Word occasionally reached Northbrook of developments within Ashwood and Ashford territory, carried by traveling merchants or the rare official correspondence between the two packs. Elena learned, through these scattered updates, that Damon and Seraphine's marriage had settled into something functional, if never quite warm, a partnership built more on mutual respect and shared duty than on the passionate connection either of them might once have hoped for. They had, by most accounts, succeeded in stabilizing the alliance between their territories fully, the fragile peace that had once nearly collapsed under the weight of scandal now standing firm, strengthened rather than weakened by having survived its most difficult test. Nolan sent a brief letter roughly a year after the incident in Northbrook, addressed simply to Elena, informing her that Ashwood remained peaceful, that Damon had thrown himself fully into his responsibilities as alpha, channeling whatever restless energy once consumed him into building a stronger, more secure future for his people. The letter mentioned nothing further about feelings or regrets, and Elena understood, reading between its careful lines, that this was Nolan's quiet way of telling her that Damon had finally found the discipline to let go completely, that whatever fixation had once threatened to unravel everything around them had settled, finally, into something manageable, something that no longer demanded a price from anyone. She read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and quiet, bittersweet closure settle over her. She did not write back. There was nothing left to say that would not risk reopening a chapter both of them had worked so hard to close. 2 years after leaving Ashwood, Elena stood beside Marcus in front of Northbrook's small pack gathering, exchanging vows that felt nothing like the tense, politically charged ceremony she had once witnessed from the back of a crowded hall. This ceremony was simple, warm, surrounded by people who had welcomed her without hesitation or suspicion, who knew her not as the center of a scandal that had nearly toppled an alliance, but simply as Elena, a woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing and found something genuine and lasting in the process. Delphine cried through the entire ceremony, and Ivy, who had traveled from Ashwood specifically for the occasion, stood beside Elena as her closest friend and witness, beaming with a happiness that spoke to how far both of their lives had traveled since that difficult chapter had begun. "You look happy," Ivy said afterward, embracing Elena tightly amid the small celebration that followed. "Truly happy. I haven't seen that look on your face in a long time." "I am happy," Elena said, and meant it completely. "It took a while to get here, but I am." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the last of the guests began drifting toward their homes, Elena stood alone for a quiet moment beneath the darkening sky, watching the stars begin to emerge over Northbrook's peaceful fields. She thought, briefly, of the person she had been 3 years earlier, the quiet pack outsider who had spent years quietly loving a man she could never have, who had lost everything she once knew in a single devastating morning, who had wondered, in her darkest moments, whether she would ever find her way back to any kind of happiness at all. She thought of Damon too, not with the aching longing that had once defined every thought of him, but with a quiet, distant gratitude for the lessons that impossible, painful chapter had taught her, about the cost of feelings left unspoken for too long, about the danger of obsession disguised as devotion, and about the resilience it took to walk away from something that could never truly have been hers, no matter how deeply either of them had wished otherwise. Marcus found her there a few minutes later, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, and Elena leaned into his warmth without hesitation, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had finally arrived exactly where she belonged. "Any regrets about today?" he asked softly, echoing his question from months before, though this time the answer required no consideration at all. "None," Elena said, turning in his arms to face him fully. "Not a single one." The story of the alpha who could not let her go, the fixation that had cost her everything she once knew, had finally, completely, become simply that, a story, a chapter closed, its painful lessons folded quietly into the foundation of a life Elena had built entirely on her own terms, far from the territory where it all began, and far stronger for everything she had survived to get there.